Okay, our next speaker is Heiko Muhr. Heiko, are you on?
Aquí, en lo rojo.
Okay, Heiko, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Just
Okay.
1 second here. Let me share the screen. Okay. So I'm going to talk about two local mapping units that operated in Norway during World War II. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk about Norway first a bit. Then I'm going to talk about the projects that I'm working on, the World War II Captured Maps project at UC Berkeley. And then I'm going to talk about the Nazi occupation of Norway and the crimes that the Nazis committed. And then I'm going to get into cartographic history. So the first thing about Norway is it's surrounded by water. You know, water is really important. In a way, it's a life-giving force because a warm current runs across the North Atlantic and along the Norwegian coast and keeps it warm. And so all the cities are on the water. The interior is pretty rough, a lot of mountains, cold, glaciers. Oops. Oh yeah, here we go. So if we look at the Norwegian mapping tradition, there's a focus on nautical charts, not so much on maps of land, you know, of territory. And there are also institutions that have worked, you know, on that for a long, long time. The Norwegian Sørkartverk, the nautical chart works, is the most important one. And there's really a proud tradition here that goes back to the 18th century. So the German captured World War II map project at UC Berkeley, we're going to digitize about 21,000 sheets, German maps that were published from the 1870s to 1945, but chiefly from the 1930s on to 1945. The project has been going on for 3 years and will likely end 2023. The maps came to us from the US Army Map Service. We received them in the 1940s. My job is to create metadata. So I'm focusing on updating and creating cataloging records. And there are two areas in particular that I'm engaged in. Name authority control, that means creating, you know, information about the bodies, the mapping agencies or mapping units that created the maps, and also information about source map data. So where does the original data come from that the Germans are using? So this is kind of what the back of the maps looks like. It's, you know, a deaccessioning stamp. It shows that the Army Map Service library owns those maps, and then they were handed over to other libraries. We were one of 35 libraries that received these maps. And so the accessioning stamp in the lower part, it's dated to 1947. Then it says distribution to the Defense Mapping Agency Topographic Center. So that's from the early 1970s, probably. So we received that map later than most other maps in the 1970s. This is the gateway, and this is how people can access the digital maps. There are different ways to access, either by clicking on the sets that are displayed here, or there's a big yellow button that says explore the maps. That's probably the easiest way to do that. So the story really starts in northern Sweden. There's a mountain here, Kirunavara. It's like one of the world's richest iron ore deposits. And it was very important for, you know, the building of the iron and steel industry in Europe. And an early railroad was built that connected the mine to ports on the Baltic Sea in Sweden, and also on the Norwegian Sea. There's a port of Narvik. You can see it. It was one of the first railroad lines that was electrified. It was really, really important to get the cargo out. During World War I, this was like a major point of contention between Sweden, Germany, and Britain. The German war economy relied on those iron ore deposits, and they convoyed ships to get that iron ore. And Britain tried to suppress that trade, and it enforced a blockade against Sweden. It, prevented the importation of foodstuffs. So there were hunger marches in Stockholm that brought down the government, but Sweden still maintained its neutrality. So there's a, World War II comes along, there's a replay. The Nazis are really interested in those iron ore deposits. They need that iron ore to maintain their war economy. So they decide to invade Norway in April 1940, and they deploy like forces to most of the main cities of Norway that land in a surprise attack. And that includes Narvik. If you look, the northernmost port is Narvik. The Norwegians, however, did fairly well. They were not totally surprised. They were able to defend the approaches to Oslo long enough for the king, Hakon, to escape. And they only surrendered several months later, but when they had been abandoned by the British and the French. They didn't really have a choice anymore. King Hakon escaped to London, and the Germans took over. There was an occupation regime. There was a Nazi party leader, Josef Terboven. He's the man with the sunglasses here, the dark sunglasses. He took over the civilian administration as Reich Commissioner of Norway. And he was a person that was responsible for numerous atrocities. There's a long list of things that he did that, are crimes, major crimes. And he also, evaded justice. He blew himself up in 1945 in a bunker. He did not surrender. Terboven worked together with a collaborationist group, the National Union. It was a fascist party in Norway. It was led by a man named Vidkun Quisling. And Quisling headed a pro-Nazi puppet government, and he was executed after 1945. There was also resistance, and its most important accomplishment was to prevent the building of the German nuclear bomb. It destroyed resources that the Germans had collected, mostly heavy water. And if we look at Nazi crimes, we can see there are concentration camps. The most important one was established near Trondheim, and there is, history, of course, of the marginalization of the Jewish population, which was mostly urban, and some people, Norwegians, ordinary Norwegians, but also Jews, were transported to Germany. And the most important transport was this one. In November 1942, the Gestapo handed over 532 Jewish prisoners to the SS in Oslo Harbor. And so they were transported to Germany, and almost all of them died. Only 9 survived. That's, one of those transports. And of course, it's not the only one. So I'm going to get into the mapping part. The CIA evaluated the German maps, and basically it decided that coastal maps were really the most important part of the German mapping operation in Norway. And of course, this was because the Germans really had to maintain control of the coastal waters because all transportation took place there. And we can see there are other mapping agencies, like the Navy is involved. It produced nautical charts. There is like a labor organization that relied on forced labor that constructed defenses as part of the Atlantic Wall. A lot of these maps were geological maps, like locating building materials. And those maps we don't have. What we have in our collection are maps produced by an organization called the Directorate for War Maps and Surveying. And it was like a military mapping agency. It reported to the general staff of the German army. And it was built up starting in 1936. This was the man who commanded it, Gerlach Hammerich. And he was, a military geodesist, a geodetic scientist, and was really interested in surveys. And there are some useful things that came out of his reports. The CIA sifted through that after World War II. So there are two local mapping units that operated in Norway. And one of them was subordinated to the Army of Norway, which was the occupying force that controlled Norway during the war. This was the commanding officer, Nikolaus von Falkenhorst. He was also, responsible for crimes during World War II and had to go to prison. And so the mapping detachments that worked for this German Army of Norway was this one here. And we can see it operated in Norway beginning in 1942, and it did some really innovative things. We can see the integration of aerial photography on the sheet. So their traditional topographic map data is on the right. On the left, we see the aerial photography. And so the unit produced maps and mapping for areas that hadn't been mapped by the Norwegians or not in sufficient quality. We also can see the map is overprinted by German military grids. There's the German Army grid, and there's also an overprint in orange that's the Army messaging web, which was used to relay messages. And here we can see on the right how that data from aerial photography was eventually used. So there are the source maps, and there's also information that's in lighter colors. That's the area where the Germans didn't have good data. There's a second unit that was working in Norway, and it also had to do with natural resources extraction. Germans were very interested in nickel deposits. Nickel was a steel hardener. And so there was like a second mapping unit that was stationed in northern Norway and Finland. And it supported the war that the Nazis waged against the Soviet Union. And it had it was motorized, so it mapped in the field. It had like a trailer that had printing equipment installed. It also operated out of a city in Finland, Rovaniemi. And one thing this mapping unit mapped was the permafrost areas, the topmost layer of the permafrost. It thawed in the summer. And those freeze-thaw cycles were really difficult. And so the mapping agency was really interested in documenting that. We can see that on this map. So then in 1944, this mapping unit retreated to northern Norway. And as the German army abandoned Rovaniemi, they burned down much of the city. which was, of course, a war crime. And then ultimately, the Red Army came in and liberated northernmost Norway in the last months of the war. So what I was trying to show here is that the German mapping operation was a bit different from the American one. It relied more on local resources. So if we compare the Army Map Service to this German Directorate of War Maps and Surveying, we can see that these local units played a huge role. So the German operation was under-resourced. It didn't have enough resources in Germany. So what it did, it relied on established facilities in Paris or Utrecht in the Netherlands and Oslo that it took over. And it relied on these local units. And that gave it a lot of flexibility. So it looked very different. Thank you.
Heiko. Thank you very much.